And let me share my screen. All right. Okay. So we were talking about price discrimination, right? And we made very unrealistic assumptions when we talked about price discrimination. Any quick questions before I start? Okay. Um, so we assumed that somehow the seller, the monopolist, knows the demand function of the consumers, right? He knows their willingness to pay in that unit demand model. In the second degree price discrimination case, we assumed that the exact demand function is known, right? And then it becomes easy for the monopolist to mop up all the consumer surplus. In reality, the sellers don't know that, right? Who has higher willingness to pay, who's a more budget conscious, price sensitive consumer, that's not written on their faces. Yes. Nevertheless, in spite of not having that information, they can tease out that information through clever strategies. So I want to talk about price discrimination under asymmetric information. Now, what the tools and techniques that we are going to use are somewhat game theoretic. So I'm being a little greedy in poaching on, the second course in the sequence. But since it's connected to the issues that we're talking about, I think I would give you a sense of how things work out under asymmetric information, right? And essentially, the technique which sellers use is called screening or self-selection or sorting. Uh, yes, they throw in some sort of wrinkle into the transaction, which sorts out high valuation, high willingness to pay customers from low willingness to pay customers. Okay, so I'll show you a little model which will illustrate these ideas and pin down the intuition. But before that, let me talk about a couple of examples. Here's an example. Um, and this is, I took this screenshot many years ago, but it captures it very well. So I haven't replaced it because the airline that you see here is lodged in our fond memories, Kingfisher Airlines, the long departed airline. Anyway, the same sort of feature is observable today. So here's the thing. This is from a travel website, yatra.com. Uh, so I looked at the fares for the Delhi Mumbai sector, yes, and the prices were under 5,000 rupees for a one-way ticket. Um, um, Now this fare was for a travel date which was more than a week away, right? I was looking more than a week in advance for a flight. But when I looked at a flight which is just a day or two later, the prices change. The prices are much higher, right? From under 5,000, it's above 7,000. So it's almost a 50% jump in prices. Yes. So the time lag, or how much in advance you buy your plane ticket, affects your price in a very significant way, right? So why is that? Cost conditions don't change. It costs the same for the airlines to carry passengers, right? Whether they're bought their tickets one day before or 2 weeks ahead of time. So that's a question. Why do you have this time-sensitive nature of prices? Here's another example. And this is from Amazon for a book, The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo. Yeah, it's a Norwegian thriller. Some of you may have read it. Trigger warning, it has a lot of, blood and gore, a lot of violence. But in any case, if you look at the pricing, there are two editions. There's a hardcover and there's a paperback. The hardcover is $26 and the paperbacks is under $10. So the hardcover is more than twice as expensive as the paperback edition. So let's ponder about that for a moment. Why is that? Yes, producing the hardcover is a little more expensive because, it's a hardcover, not a soft cover. But the cost difference is minuscule. Yeah, the cost difference is hardly enough to explain why there's such a big price gap between the two kinds of editions. So what do you think is going on here?
Typically, people who would like to buy the hardcover are collectors or fans of the series or of the author. So they are willing to pay a premium to get the hardcover copy, which has a enduring life compared to the paperback.
Yeah. So you're saying that, there are fans who want to collect the book for posterity. They want to preserve it in their libraries for a long time because they think it's a masterpiece. So they want a more durable edition and they go for hardcover, and there are casual readers who will read it and toss it aside. And for them, it's priced lower. Presumably, the idea is that the true fans are also, not only do they want to preserve it, but they also are willing to pay a much higher price, right?
Yes, sir.
Anybody else with any ideas, suggestions?
Sir, maybe to demotivate the buyers and want them to buy paperback edition, like which is biodegradable or recyclable.
So the paperback edition is because the publisher is environmentally conscious.
Maybe.
Yes, sir.
But then they should, if they are really so conscious, they should, a couple of things. Then why are they bringing out the hardcover, right? They should really stick to the paperback, right? And secondly, yeah.
Sir, or even better, stick to just Kindle.
Say that again. First of all, Ria was saying something. Let's go one by one. Ria, what was your comment?
Sir, the hardcover price might specifically be mentioned to be higher to incentivize them to compare them and thus go for the paperback when they compare both the prices. So they might feel that, okay, paperback is much cheaper in comparison to the hardcover, and they might go ahead with the paperback when they see both the prices in comparison.
That's an interesting idea. What Ria is saying is that the hardcover is really a ruse. They don't really intend to send the hardcover. It's just a framing, if you will, some sort of framing effect, that if you just put out a paperback at $10, people might grumble that, this is too expensive. So you put an even more expensive thing out there so that the paperback seems sort of attractive by comparison. So this explanation is what may be called behavioral economics, right? It's kind of like that framing effect that I talked about. All right, that's an interesting suggestion. Devesh, you were asking a question, I think.
Sir, I was just commenting on the bit about the environmental side.
The environmental thing, yeah.
Publisher, yes, so then he would just stick to digital editions. He would not even publish paperbacks.
Right, right.
So
Yes, Sneha.
Hardcovers are usually published much before the paperback. So I think the fanatics, they don't want to wait for the paperback and are willing to pay a much larger price to get their hands on the first editions.
Excellent. So let me show you the next slide. Okay. Uh, so what were the publishing dates? The hardcover came out on January 1st, 2008. The paperback came out on January 1st, 2009, a full year later. And this is no accident. I didn't cherry pick the data here, right? You can go on Amazon and check for many other titles, and you will see the same pattern, that the hardcover, the much more expensive hardcover cover comes out first, and they really delay the paperback edition by a year or so. Uh, and that probably has a lot to do with it. What does it have to do with it? Well, the big fans, so you can think of two kinds of readers: ones who are big fans of the author or the genre, and they really want to get their hands on the book as soon as it comes out, because they want to participate in the buzz, right? They want to talk about it the moment it comes out, when it's very much um, part of the zeitgeist, right? The cultural milieu. Um, and yes, they can wait for a year and get it at half the price, but they'll miss out on the cultural participation of discussing the book with their friends, with others on the internet, and so on. Um, so the true fans have higher willingness to pay and lower willingness to wait. The value of the book is higher for them, right? But you can't observe that you can't pick out who are the true fans and who are the more casual readers. So the true fans have a higher value of willingness to pay for the book, and the delay is more costly for them, right? So the cost of waiting is correlated with the willingness to pay, and that is what they're exploiting. Yes, by creating two options. One of the options involving waiting, they know that the ones who have higher willingness to pay will be reluctant to wait. So that's why the earlier edition is priced higher, and the paperback edition is priced lower, right? They might just as well said that uh, bring out one edition hardcover and paperback, but just say that 1 year later we'll have a price drop, right? That would have sufficed. So the hardcover versus softcover distinction is really a red herring. It's not particularly important. What is important is that if you want a discounted price, you have to wait for a long time. And for the true fans, that's very costly. Using that cost difference between the true fans and the casual readers to drive a wedge, and make them sort into different bins, if you will, self-select into different bins. Um, and that's a very clever way of price discriminating, when you cannot at the outset tell what the willingness to pay of various buyers, various readers is. So it's using time cost for price discrimination. Here's another example. You see this all the time, that you buy something and you have these coupons, for example. So if you go to the travel websites, right, there's an official price, but if you input a coupon code in Yatra, trip, what's the Travelocity, whatever, you get a reduction. Yes, but these coupons are it's annoyingly difficult to find the right coupon, right? You have to go to a website, you have to search. There are various coupon codes. Some of them work, some of them don't. These websites give you, what's the percentage of success? This coupon worked 67% of the time. That coupon worked 38% of the time, etc., etc. Yeah. And then you have other things like, you go to the store and you try to buy an electronic equipment and they have a cashback offer, right? You pay some price, but then you have to fill up a form, mail it in, or, and then sometime later they pay you back some money into your bank account. It's a pain. So if they really want to lower the price to attract more buyers, why don't they just lower the sticker price, right? Uh, there's a TV they're selling for 20,000 rupees and they have a 10% or 2,000 rupees cashback offer, but you have to jump through these hoops. You have to hunt for coupons. You have to, fill up some complicated form. Instead of that, why don't they just lower the price from 20,000 rupees to 18,000? Sakshi, please switch off your microphone.
So because these coupons automatically price discriminate. Sort of, so
How? That's the thing.
so people who are willing to pay more would not go to the lengths of finding the coupons and all of that.
That's right. So hunting for coupons is costly, right? But there's a pattern to it. The cost is not the same for everyone. Who are the people who are willing to pay more? Maybe people who are more affluent, who are busy, whereas the bargain hunters are people who have less income. Maybe they're pensioners, they have plenty of time on their hands. So again, there's a correlation between the willingness to pay and the cost of searching for coupons or filling up these forms, right? The valuation or the willingness to pay is not statistically independent from the cost of coupon hunting. There's a correlation, there's a positive correlation, and that is what they're exploiting. Yes, there will be some people who don't mind paying more, but really mind spending time on these coupons because they're busy, right? So those guys don't avail of the coupons, right? Whereas there are others who wouldn't have brought it at the sticker price, but the cost of coupon hunting is low. So they search and find the coupons and get a discounted price and they buy it at the discounted price. So once again, they are using self-selection or sorting to separate consumers into different bins, high valuation and low valuation consumers. And they're exploiting that to price discriminate where they don't automatically have information about who's what type of customer, right? Last example, then there's another example on the slides which uses rationing. So to go to the concert, you can buy a high price ticket and then you have a guaranteed seat. But there are some last minute cheaper tickets, but they're rationed. There aren't enough of them. So you don't know for sure if you try to attend with a cheaper ticket whether you'll get one, right? There could be a lottery, there could be a queue. So you have only some chance of getting it at the cheaper price. So people, again, affluent people, true fans, they would rather make sure that they get to attend the concert and they'll be willing to pay more. Whereas there are other more casual fans or poorer customers who will take their shot at the lottery for the cheap ticket. One last example, which I think is fairly dramatic and ironic. Xerox has various models of photocopiers, right? So there's so one of their models was more expensive and faster, right? 10 pages per minute or some really fast device. And there was another model which was cheaper, but of course it's slower. It's like 6 pages per minute. It turns out that the cheaper model was actually more expensive to produce. Yes. Why is that? Because they really, on the factory floor, they really produce one model, which is the faster model. And then they inserted some extra things, hardware or software, to slow it down to 6 pages per minute, right? So they produce one thing. And for some of those photocopiers, they incurred extra cost to slow it down, but they sold those at a lower price. Yes. So the lower price model was more expensive to produce. and deliberately so. They could have avoided that expense by letting it run faster, but they didn't do that. So why is that? Again, people with higher willingness to pay also care more about speed, right? Maybe these are corporate offices, business houses, who have to photocopy thousands of pages a day, and speed is very important for them, and they have, generous budgets. So again, there's a correlation between willingness to pay in the first place and the cost of the burden, namely the slowing down of the machine that was placed in the cheaper models. Yes. Um, so you can see a general pattern emerging here, right? In all these cases, one feature is some burden is placed on some consumers. First of all, the seller creates multiple options, right? And let people choose between them. That's one thing they do. In the cheaper option, they insert some inconvenient feature, right? In the photocopier, they made it slower. Um, for the book, they made the cheaper edition come out later. They didn't need to do so. It was a deliberate, costly feature that was introduced in the cheaper version, right? Uh, Now, that seems a little paradoxical on the face of it, because in general, uh, if a seller uh, introduces a feature which makes the product less attractive, less valuable, uh, on the face of it, it seems like that shouldn't be in the interest of the seller, right? Because if you reduce the attractiveness or the value of the product to your customers, you could charge a lower price. So it boomerangs on you as the seller, right? So on the face of it, it seems like paradoxical behavior. The reason they do it is it helps them sort out people into higher willingness to pay and lower willingness to pay customers, allows them to price discriminate without directly having access to information about willingness to pay. And all things considered, it increases their profits.
Sir, just a small question.
Yeah,
Uh, uh, so when we visit tourist places
yeah,
and attractions, usually there is a pricing that is different for locals, and there is a pricing that is different for tourists or foreigners.
right.
Is that also an example of price discrimination, or is that something different? Is it more of trying to exploit some sort of a captive base that they have?
That's an example of price discrimination, but it won't fit into these sort of examples of clever ways of teasing out information, because the information that they're using to price discriminate is already there. It's there in the passport, right? So when you look at identity documents, that is a direct way of separating out foreigners from Indians. So it is price discrimination, but through a more direct route. So sometimes that is possible, right? So the other examples like, student discounts, senior citizen discounts, having different prices for the Indian edition and the American edition, those are price discrimination where the information is directly available about different market segments, right? The richer, less price sensitive segment versus the more budget conscious segment. So sometimes you can do it directly. In the examples that I talked about, the firm at the outset does not have any clue who has higher willingness to pay, who has lower willingness to pay. They are not even able to divide people into different groups. They can try. For example, the airlines can say that corporate buyers will, there's a price, there's a corporate price, and there's a, individual price. But then the corporates will give an expense account to their employees and ask them to buy individually, right? So arbitrage will destroy uh, direct price discrimination. Yes. So your example, yes, it's an example, but it's a direct price discrimination rather than price discrimination through this sort of sorting, right? Now, what's the motivation? Perhaps part of the motivation of the government to have this dual pricing is that, yeah, the foreign tourists probably have fatter wallets and higher willingness to pay. That could be part of the motivation, but part of the motivation is also social. I think that, in a sense, we citizens are paying through other means, through our taxes. Our taxes go into preserving these monuments, right? So that's one rationale that can be given to partly justify this, that we have implicitly paid already to some extent. So that's the other thing.
Thank you, sir.
So,
Yeah.
Yeah. So the pricing mechanism which multiplex use can be an example of price discrimination of timing kind of thing. Like they have different prices for different timings. And in fact, they have different prices for the first rows and second rows, like this kind of pricing. Can it be example of price discrimination where like seller does not know the demand curve of the consumer?
It could be. It could be. I mean, the thing is that so one difference is, if you look at different prices for different positions, right? Front rows versus back rows versus middle versus balcony. Those are not artificially created, right? Any theater, there will be a front row and there will be a back row. And the experience of watching from the front row and the back row are not the same. So the different seats are naturally differentiated. Yes. The difference in these examples is that the difference is artificially created. Yes. And the less attractive options are deliberately made less attractive by incurring a cost. That's not a thing that you find in your theater example, right? The time slots or the seats are intrinsically different from each other. So even if there was no price discrimination motive, you will find some natural variation in the prices because, the 11 o'clock show at night is less attractive to moviegoers compared to, a prime time 7 o'clock show, right? So that itself will make some price difference. Or whether there's some extra exploitation of that natural difference to further create price discrimination, that's an interesting question. These are the kind of things which empirical economists try to tease out, that if you look at the ticket price difference between various time slots, to what extent is it a product of natural differences in consumer valuation of the different time slots, and to what extent is it an extra price discrimination feature on top of that. But it lacks this thing that is a deliberate downgrading of one of the options. That feature is not there.
Thank you.
Okay, so let me show you a little model which captures this, right? And this is a model of screening. And this has wide relevance, right? Not just to the study of monopoly and price discrimination and so on. For example, just to give you one example, it's very relevant. The analysis that we're going to see could be very relevant to public finance issues. For example, welfare schemes. So take NREGA, our welfare employment guarantee scheme, right? The government wants to help poor people, especially agricultural workers, because they have in the agricultural lean season, they find it difficult to earn money. Many of them migrate to the cities, work in temp jobs, construction jobs, etc. So the government wanted to create some income guarantee for large sections of our population. One way to try and do that is just put money in people's bank accounts, some sort of, DBT, direct benefit transfer. Now, if the government says whoever needs, we are offering, 3,000 rupees a month to whoever needs it, right? So then all kinds of people will come and claim it. Not everyone, maybe. Sometimes, the government relies on the goodwill of citizens, of affluent citizens, to forego their entitlement. And lots of people do sign up for that. So one example is the scheme to give up the gas, the cheaper gas connections, right? And there were, lakhs and lakhs of people who surrendered their subsidized gas connections. But not everybody will. So if money is offered and the government has to rely on the goodwill of the affluent not to claim it, then still lots of people will claim it, and it'll put some burden on the government budget. One argument for workfare like NREGA is that it has good self-selection properties, right? So if you have a job with a good salary, if claiming the money just requires filling up a form or dropping by an office for half an hour, then you may be willing to do it on your way to work. But if claiming that money requires spending days doing arduous work on the fields, then the affluent, won't find it worthwhile to try and claim. They have a job to do, and the work is punishing or very hard. So workfare programs, even if the government creates the work which is not useful. For example, if the government says we have this employment guarantee program, and if you sign up for it, we'll ask you to dig up ditches and fill them up, right? Work of no social value. It still has a self-selection value, because people who are genuinely in need of money and don't have work will come and sign up. Others won't, right? Now, it so happens that for NREGA, it tries to create things which are of social value. It's not just asking people to dig up ditches and fill them up. But I'm just saying that even if more productive opportunities are not present, just requiring as a condition for getting the government assistance that you have to do some work which is of little use, even that is useful for self-selection purposes. Yes? So the relevance of what we are going to see in this model is not just to marketing. The relevance is to public policy and many other issues. Okay, so here's a very simple, highly stylized model, right? Just to bring out the core idea. Let's say there are two types of consumers in the market. There's high value types and low value types. High value types have a value VH, that is to say, that is their willingness to pay. And low value types are willing to pay up to VL, and VL is less than VH. That's why that's the difference. And their proportions in the market are alpha and 1 minus alpha. So there's a continuum of consumers. Alpha fraction are high value, 1 minus alpha fraction are low value. The critical thing is that consumers' valuation is private information to themselves, right? So the high value people, only they themselves know that they are willing to pay a lot, and the seller cannot tell who's high value, who's low value, right? That's what makes the problem interesting. That's why we are studying it. Cost of production, let's say, is 0, right? Again, simplification. Now, the seller could keep it simple and adopt a uniform pricing strategy, meaning that the seller can just choose one price. Yes, I'm not trying to be too clever. So in the class of those strategies, just announcing one price, what is the optimal thing for the seller to do? Well, there are only two candidates for an optimal price, as you can see, in this very simple setup, right? If the seller chooses a price above VL, then none of the low value people will buy it, right? So in that case, why not push the price all the way up to VH, the willingness to pay of the high value types. So that's one candidate for an optimum price. Set it equal to VH. The other candidate for an optimal price is VL. Once you lower the price to VL, you're getting the entire market. Both types are buying it. And you don't need to reduce the price any further. Yeah. All right. So if you're setting the price at VH, the total revenue is alpha times VH, right? The alpha fraction will buy it at the price VH. And if you're setting the price at VL, the entire market will buy it. So that's of size 1. So 1 times VL. So everything depends on how alpha VH compares to VL. The optimal price is a higher price if the first inequality is true. So the profit is the minimum of these two values, whichever is higher. right? The corresponding price will be the optimal price. Let us think about the case where alpha VH is strictly less than VL, okay? So there aren't that many high value consumers in the market. And so it's optimal for the seller to keep the price low and make money through volume rather than margin. Yes. And so let's focus on the case. So if that is the case, then the seller really has a lament that I know there are these high value customers out there. They're willing to pay much more, but I can't spot them. And so I cannot exploit their fatter wallets and bigger bank accounts and their more keenness for the product. Yes. So if you are advising this this seller, what would you advise? Can you suggest a technique or a trick which will allow them to charge a higher price above the baseline price of VL to these people without knowing who these people are? Yes. All right. So here's where the price discrimination by screening comes in. So suppose the monopolist can impose a burden B on consumers, right? The burden can take many different forms depending on the product and the context. I have already talked about several examples. The burden could be in the form of a delay, in the form of the hassle of coupon hunting, uncertainty about whether you will get the product or not as a buyer, and so on. Yes. A slower product, etc., etc. So in general, let's call it a burden B. The burden B is not a natural feature. It's something that can be created. It's an option that the seller has, right? And it seems like a self-destructive option, but it won't be because of its screening advantages, as I said. Cost of the burden is CH for the high value types and CL for the low value types. And we are going to assume that CH is greater than CL. In fact, we are going to assume a little bit more, but I'll show you the exact assumption in a moment. So that's the idea. People who value the product more also suffer more if the burden is placed on them, right? People who are willing to pay a lot more for the photocopier also suffer a bigger cost if the photocopier is slower. This correlation is absolutely critical. If these things are independent, then this kind of screening will not work. It will not be profitable. Yes. So value and costs are positively correlated, which would be a plausible feature in many cases.
Is CH greater than CL because of higher opportunity cost to high valued customers?
Think of all the examples I gave, right? I mean, don't you think, like the photocopier, for example, right? Who are the people with a higher willingness to pay? Maybe sort of corporate offices, institutions. They have bigger budgets, so they can spend more on the product. But those are precisely also the people who make heavy use of the photocopier, so speed is important to them. The home buyers, a lot of them, not all of them, will typically be more budget conscious, so they have lower willingness to pay. And they're doing their once in a while they have a photocopying job in their home office, right? They're not running the machine that frequently, so speed won't be that important to them. So it's a plausible assumption for that example that value or willingness to pay is correlated with costs, right? It won't be true in all cases, but in many of the examples, you probably will say that the assumption is reasonable, seems realistic. For the book, the true fans, the really mad fans of the author, are willing to pay more to buy the book, but they're also unwilling to wait a lot to get their hands on it. right? That's what we would think would be their psychology. So that's why we're making the assumption, right? It will be relevant in many contexts, but probably not true in some contexts. Okay, now, here's how it works. So the monopolist will create a menu. It will place two options on the table for buyers, and the buyers can choose which buying option they want to exercise. So one option will be a high price, but it will not have this burden that we're talking about. You don't have to wait. You don't have to stand in a line. You don't have to suffer a slower product. Yes. So if you want a hassle-free, burden-free experience, you have to pay a higher price. They'll create another option, a slower photocopier, a book which comes out 1 year later, and so on, where you, as a consumer, if you choose that option, you do get a lower price, right? So you save money, but you have to bear the burden. You have to wait, you have to stand in line, and so on. Now, why is the monopolist one creating it? First of all, the monopolist wants to create these options so that the high value people separate out from the low value people. The intent is the high value people will choose the first option and the low value people will choose the second option. Yes. Of course, the assumption is that even though the monopolist doesn't know who is which type, but these other numbers like VH, VL, alpha, these are common knowledge that, through market research, market surveys, the sort of aggregate feature of the market has been discovered by the seller, but not the feature of an individual buyer. That's unknown. So the seller wants to devise these two options. First of all, he has to guarantee, as I said, these two options. If everybody chooses one of the two options, the other option is basically redundant, right? He might just as well not bother creating the two options. So he wants to create the options so that the two self-selection constraints are satisfied. The first one says that for the high value types, the net cost of buying the expensive option, the net cost is lower. What is the net cost? If he buys the high value option, is paying PH. If he's buying the low value option, he's paying the direct price PL, plus also the cost of the burden, which is CH for the high value types. So if this inequality is true, all things considered, the high value type will find it cheaper to buy actually the more expensive option because he's avoiding the burden and its associated costs. Whereas if this inequality is true, that means the low value type will find the second option more attractive because even after counting the cost of the burden, it's cheaper than the other option, right? So these two inequalities, if they're satisfied, and they are called respectively the incentive constraints. This is the incentive constraint of the high type. The second inequality is the incentive constraint of the low type. So if these two incentive constraints are satisfied, that means that there will be sorting of customers between the two options. So some will choose option A, the others will choose option B, and both the options are going to be meaningful and relevant. All right. Now, that is not the only thing that the seller has to satisfy. The seller also has to make sure that at least one of the options is, there's a third option, which is not to buy. So the seller has to make sure that none of the types of consumers drop out or vote with their feet and leave, right? All of them want to buy under at least one of the options. Yes, the option which is meant for them or targeted towards them is attractive enough. That has to be guaranteed. So that gives us two inequalities which are called participation constraints, one for each type. So PCH is a participation constraint of the high type, PCL for the low type. What is PCH saying? Well, if the self-selection constraints are satisfied, the high type will go for this option, right? But is this option worth it? Well, his consumer surplus from this option is VH minus PH, right? So that has to be non-negative. So if this is satisfied, then the high type will, between the two options, he will prefer this, but moreover, he will prefer this to not buying, yes. And Similarly, we have the participation constraint for the low type, which looks different because the low type is supposed to find the second option, the cheaper option, more attractive. And this is just saying that that option itself is better than not buying. All right. And now, what is the monopolist solving? The monopolist is, this is the monopolist's revenue, and therefore its profit, because we have assumed zero cost. To alpha fraction, they are selling at a price PH through the first option. To 1 minus alpha fraction, they're selling at a price PL through the second option. And they're choosing the two prices, right? Those are the choice variables. So they want to design the contract, choose the two prices in a way that their profits are maximum possible, and these incentive and participation constraints are satisfied. Because if one of them is violated, then the right expression for profits won't be this. It will be, one of the components will drop out. So, so maximize this subject to these 4 inequality constraints. That's the monopolist's problem. And the choice variables are the two prices, the higher price and the lower price. Questions?
Sir, CL, like what is CL and CH? Can you please tell once time?
CL and CH are the costs, right? So
Okay.
what are we saying? That in the second option, the monopolist artificially introduces a burden. The burden, like in all the examples that I said, the burden could be a delay, could be a slower product, etc. Now, that burden, of course, will be costly to the consumer who's buying through that option, right? And CL is the cost of the burden to the low type, the low valuation type. CH is the cost of the burden to the high valuation type.
Okay, sir. Okay.
Yeah. Okay, so how do we solve a model like this? Well, it seems kind of complicated because, there are 4 inequality, the constraints are inequality constraints, and there are 4 of them, so it seems a little daunting. If you look at it closely, it turns out that things simplify, right? So let me take a couple of steps back and tell you what exactly is the analytical strategy for solving a problem. It turns out that if we look at the constraints and the problem closely, we can drop 2 of these constraints, right? Because the nature of the optimization and the nature of the other constraints will allow us to throw away 2 of these constraints. If you throw away 2 of the constraints, the solution, namely the price pair, will not change. We'll have the same solution. We can come up with arguments to that effect. So we'll throw away 2 of the constraints. And then we can make further arguments that the 2 remaining constraints have to hold with equality, right? Although they are inequality constraints, at the optimum, those constraints will be binding. Yes, so they'll hold with equality. So the set of 4 inequality constraints will boil down through a few steps of logical reasoning to a set of 2 equality constraints. And we have 2 unknowns, right? So the 2 equality constraints can be solved, and the solution will give us the optimal values of pH and PL, right? So analytically, just to give you an overview, I'll go through the steps of the reasoning, but just to give you an overview, that's how it goes, right? We can infer that 2 of these constraints will be redundant. The solution won't change if we toss them out. And then we'll further argue that the other 2 will be holding with equality at the optimum point. And then we solve those 2 equations to solve for the optimal values of pH and PL, right?
Sir, a small question.
Yes.
Sir, in the third equation or the first participation constraint that we took, so why haven't we subtracted CH on the left-hand side? Because that's also a burden that is imposed on the high-value customers.
No, there are many moving pieces here, and you have to keep track of them, right? If the first 2 constraints are satisfied, what will happen? The high-value people, if they buy at all, they'll prefer the first option. And the low-value people, if they buy at all, they'll prefer the second option. Now, when we are trying to make sure that both of them will buy and not walk away, we have to make sure that the option which the high value people want to choose, namely the first option, is attractive enough to them. And the option with which the low value people choose is attractive to them, right? Between these two, if the high value people find this more attractive, we don't have to worry about whether the lesser option is attractive to them. Who cares, right? If they find their preferred option as better than not buying, then we are fine. The seller is fine. And similarly for the low value type. Yes? Self-selection makes sure that when we are writing down the participation constraints, we don't have to look at the option which this type doesn't prefer.
So then, what does taking CL in the second participation constraint, how does that benefit the participation constraint? How does that ensure that that the both customers, the low type customer would also want to buy? I mean, if we just take VL minus PL, I mean, still that would imply by the same logic that the lower value customer would want to buy.
Look at the ICL. What is ICL saying? That the low value type finds the burdensome option cheaper.
Yes, sir.
Right? So if he buys at all, he will buy through this option. Okay? But now comes the question, so we have guaranteed this inequality, right? Now comes the question, will he buy at all? Right? So he'll buy at all if his value is less than the cost of the cheaper option which he prefers. And that is this.
Okay, sir. Okay.
Right? Okay, now we are going to make one assumption and then go through the steps of reasoning. The assumption is as follows. The high value types have a higher willingness to pay. The value of the product is greater for them compared to the others. And the difference is this, VH minus VL. But the burden is also more costly to them. And the difference is this. So we are assuming that their extra value or extra willingness to pay is greater than the extra cost they suffer if the burden is placed on them. This sort of assumption is sometimes called the single crossing property. We'll study this in more detail in your second course, right? But let's make this assumption. It's possible, right? The profitability of price discrimination can be shown under this assumption, yes? So let's assume this, that they suffer more cost if the product is slower, if there's a delay in getting it. But they're really, really keen about it, and the extra value they get from the product is more than the extra cost they suffer if they have to buy the cheaper option. Okay, now, as I said, the overall strategy will remove two constraints and then we'll reduce the other two to equality constraints. Which two can we remove? As the first step, we can remove the participation constraint of the high type. Why can we remove it? Because this inequality, this constraint is implied by the other constraints, right? Namely, it's on the slides, which are the constraints. And essentially, you can see why this claim is true under this assumption, right? So suppose participation constraint of the low type is satisfied. So the low type finds at least the cheaper option to be good enough, right? So if he buys it through the cheaper option with the burden, then it's better than not buying for the low type, right? PCL is satisfied, let's say. Now, if the high type buys through the cheaper option, he suffers an extra cost, but he also gets an extra value, and the extra value is more than the extra cost. So if the low type finds the cheaper option attractive enough relative to not buying, so will the high type. Yes. And that is why PCH can be dropped. As long as PCL is satisfied and this assumption is true, PCH can be dropped, right? It doesn't change the nature of the solution. Okay. These steps are slightly intricate, so I will go through them, but you will also later when you're studying, you go through them slowly and you satisfy yourself that the logic holds, right? But this is step one. So eliminate PCH. Second step, once we have tossed out the participation constraint of the high type, we can argue that the participation constraint of the low type must be binding at the optimum. If the monopolist is choosing optimally, then PCL has to be binding. The logic is that if it's not binding, both the prices can be increased by a small amount without violating any of the constraints and increasing the profit in the process, right? If you can increase both the prices by small amounts, of course, your profit will go up. The worry is that, will you end up violating some constraint? If PCL is not binding, there is room to increase both the prices by at least some small amount. Why is that? Let me go back to the constraints. Here are our 4 constraints. In step 1, we said PCH is redundant, right? It is implied by the other constraints. So in your mind, forget about PCH, right? And now suppose PCL is non-binding. Yes, PCL must be binding, right? So suppose PCL, this last inequality is strict, let's say, okay? What if we increase both the prices by some small epsilon? Let's go through the constraints one by one and see if we are in danger of violating one of them. In the first constraint, PH and PL occur on both sides, right? So if I increase both of them by, if I'm satisfying the inequality to begin with, and I increase each by the same epsilon, I still satisfy the inequality. No problem there, right? Same is true for the second inequality. PL, PH appear on both sides. You can increase them by the same amount. It won't be violated. The last constraint, if it were holding with equality, there is no room to increase PL. But if it's strict, then there is a little bit of room to increase PL. So you're fine, right? So that tells us that as a second step, PCL has to hold with equality, right? Now, once we are convinced about the first 2 steps and the conclusions, as a third step, we can conclude that incentive constraint of the high type must be binding at the optimum. Yes. If it's not why? If it's not binding, then there's a bit of room to increase the higher of the 2 prices by a small amount without violating any of the constraints and increasing the profits, right? So again, ICH must be binding, because if it were not binding, the seller would be able to increase the higher priced option, the price of the higher priced option, by at least some small amount. Let's see why that is true. Here's ICH. Suppose this is a strict inequality, right? If it's a strict inequality, obviously, there's a little increase in pH which will not violate it, not flip it around. If you look at the second constraint, if you increase pH, the second constraint is strengthened. It's not weakened, right? pH has to be greater than something, so you can increase pH without violating this. PCH was thrown away, and PCL is binding, but pH, the higher price, appears nowhere in the last constraint, right? So pH doesn't affect this one. pH affects this in a favorable way. You can increase pH without violating it. And here, if the inequality is strict, a little increase in pH won't reverse it, okay? So that tells us the third step has to be true. ICH has to be binding. Last step, so we have thrown away one of the inequalities. It is implied by the other constraints, so we don't have to worry about it. Then we have argued that participation constraint of the low valuation consumers and incentive constraint of the high valuation consumers have to be binding at the optimum point, at the optimum prices. Yes. And as a last step, we can conclude that incentive constraint of the low type can be dropped, right? If these two are binding, then that implies that the incentive constraint of the low type is automatically satisfied, and we can drop it from the analysis. Why is that? Essentially, a binding ICH implies that, right? A binding ICH means what? The high type is indifferent between the two options. That's what it means, right? The high type is indifferent between the cheaper option and with the burden, and the more expensive option without the burden. So if you go for the more expensive version, you save on the cost of the burden, but you pay a higher price. And in this trade-off, the high type finds himself indifferent. Now, of course, then the low type will strictly prefer the cheaper option, because for the low type, it's less costly, right? For the high type, if the price saving is just equal to the extra cost, for the low type, the price saving will be strictly higher than the extra cost, because for the low type, the burden is less costly. So that immediately guarantees that if the incentive constraint is binding for the high type, is indifferent, then the low type cannot even be indifferent. The low type will have to strictly prefer the cheaper option, right? Okay, so last step, as we said, two of the inequality constraints can be thrown away, and the other two will have to hold with equality at the optimum point. And those are the, so we can solve those two equalities.
So can you please explain?
One second.
Yes, sir.
So we can solve those two equalities. Those are equations in two unknowns, and they give us this solution, right? So these are the optimal values of PL and PH, or the candidates for the optimum values. I've written assume this. I already spelled out that assumption, so I'm just repeating that here. Now, if the monopolist creates this, right, finally, let's do the profit calculation, right? If you have to create a menu and result in price discrimination, and right, this is the optimal way of doing it. Now, it's still a question whether this is too clever by half, whether, if the monopolist creates this sort of menu options and charges these prices, whether his profits will be higher than the more simple option of just charging one price to everyone. Okay, so let's calculate the profits. Okay, alpha fraction are high valuation customers. So, sorry. Yes, alpha fraction are high valuation customers. So from them, the monopolist gets whatever price he charges, which is this, right? And 1 minus alpha are low valuation customers. And from them, the monopolist charges this, right? That's what we have solved. So we have just plugged in the optimal prices that we found. And you weight them by the size of these two market segments. And then you get this expression. And so now this says that if alpha CH minus CL is greater than 0, remember, in the uniform pricing case, VL is what is getting, right? So price discrimination is better than uniform pricing if this is true, which means that if alpha, the fraction of high valuation people, is high enough. Of course, if there's the fraction of high valuation people is minuscule, then this is not worth it. Yes. So that has to be high enough. But you can find a high enough fraction so that this term is positive, and then this kind of price discrimination will fetch higher profits than uniform pricing. look at the two prices we have derived, right? So if he went for uniform pricing, he would be charging VL, right? Provided, both segments are large enough, he would be charging VL. Now, this clever ploy makes him charge less from the low valuation types. Instead of VL, now they're paying minus CL because the burden has placed on them, reducing the value of consuming the product for them, right? So here, the monopolist has destroyed his own profits to some extent by creating that option with the burden. But in the process, he is able to isolate the high valuation types. They flock towards the other option, and he's able to charge more than VL to those people. So that's the trade-off. And when there's enough of these types, this extra price he's able to charge them more than makes up for the lower price he has to charge the low value guys. Yes. Okay, so that model illustrates how this is done. One thing is that from a social perspective, this is a dead weight loss, right? That burden B reduces the overall value to society, right? The monopolist gains in terms of profits through creating this sort of price discrimination. He earns more profits. Consumers lose out on consumer surplus. It so happens that the consumers lose out more because that burden creates a dead weight loss. Some people who choose the cheaper option, they have to suffer the burden and its associated costs, right? The fact that Xerox was deliberately slowing down some of the machines reduced overall value. The fact that the publisher was deliberately bringing out some of these titles as much as a year later reduced overall social surplus, right? So once again, you see a tension between the profit motive and general social welfare. Yeah. So that's something to keep in mind. The other thing, let me point out, is that yes, they can create this sort of price discrimination. They can, through these clever ploy, separate out the two classes of consumers. But notice that at the end of it all, they're not able to charge VH from these guys. Because if they were charging VH, they won't separate themselves out, right? If they were trying to take every drop of consumer surplus away in the more expensive option, then even the high valuation guys will go for the cheaper option. Yes. So there's limits to which the prices can be raised for these guys. So if you look at their consumer surplus, it's VH minus VL. It's the value difference minus the cost difference, and that's positive. Remember the assumption. So if the seller can successfully sort out the high value and the low value types, but the seller has to still give some consumer surplus to the high value types, and that's called information rent. The high value types don't have much market power. They're facing a monopolist, right? So they're weak. But the fact that they know who they are gives them what is called information rent, meaning that whatever the cleverest thing which the seller can devise will still have to keep a little gap between the willingness to pay of these guys and the price that they're charged. Questions? Somebody was asking a question. I held off on that. Please go ahead.
Yes, sir. Can you please explain step number 4 again of that in the previous slide?
Sir, step 1 also, if possible.
Yes, so this binding incentive constraint H implies incentive constraint of L.
Yes. Well, let me start with step 1, then repeat. So the recording will be there. You can view it again. So I will be brief. I will not try to absolutely iron out every, take out, every fog that there might exist in your minds at this point. But let me still have a second go. Step 1, what is step 1 saying? Step 1 is saying that the participation constraint of the high type can be dropped. Why can it be dropped? Because the other constraints, the other inequalities imply this inequality. Mathematically, if I look at the problem formulation, this is PCH. The argument is that if the other three inequalities are true, you can prove that this inequality will also have to be true. There's no way. So it is not an independent inequality, mathematically speaking. Right? Now, why is that? Why am I saying that? I'm saying that for the following reason. Instead of being mechanical, let me try it intuitively. Yes. If participation constraint of the low type is true, that means the low type finds at least this option worth buying through this option. Yes. Now, what if the high type also exercises this option? The high type will get some extra value compared to the low type, but will also face an extra cost. Our assumption guarantees that if the high type is exercising the same option, then the extra value he gets, the VH minus VL, is more than the extra cost he faces. So if this option is attractive enough relative to not buying for the low type, it will be attractive enough relative to not buying for the high type. Now, for the high type, there's another option, and that option is even more attractive. So the less attractive of the two options is still better than not buying for the high type, as long as it's better for the low type. So that's step one, really, essentially. Yeah. Now, step four comes later. By this point, we have argued that this constraint can be thrown away, and these other two constraints have to hold with equality, right? And then the last step is argues that provided the first three steps are true, incentive constraint of the high type will imply incentive constraint of the low type, and so ICL can be dropped. Once PCL and ICH hold with equality, that automatically implies ICL, and so it can be dropped. Okay, why is that? Again, let me try to be intuitive in the explanation. Binding ICH. ICH is binding. What does that mean? That means the high type is indifferent between these two options. Why is he indifferent between these two options? Because the price difference, PH minus PL, is exactly equal to the cost difference for him. And for him, the cost difference is CH. Right? So PH minus PL is exactly equal to CH. That's why the high type is indifferent between these two options. Now let's look at the low type. For the low type, the price difference is the same, PH minus PL. But the cost difference between these two options is CL, which is less than CH. And so if the high type is indifferent between these two options, if he finds the price difference exactly equal to the cost of the burden, the low type will find the price difference to be bigger than the cost of the burden, because that was our assumption, positive correlation between value and cost. So that's the fourth step, right? Binding ICH means ICL is automatically guaranteed. If the high type is indifferent between these two, the low type will always lean towards the cheaper option because he faces a lower cost of the burden.
So in the first step, the last point, shouldn't be VH is greater than equal to PH instead of CH?
Yeah, that's a typo. Sorry. It should be PH. Yeah. That's what we are trying to prove, right? That's PCH. So it should be PH. Thanks. Please correct that.
Okay, sir.
Questions?
So can you please go back to the slide where you define the two types of customers?
Yeah.
So I didn't get this part. Uniform pricing strategy, charge P is equals to VH if alpha VH is greater than equals to VL.
So if the monopolist charges VH, the high value guys will buy it. They're indifferent. The low value guys won't buy it, right? The price is higher than their willingness to pay. So only these types will buy, the high value types. And the measure of those people is alpha fraction, right? So alpha fraction of your buyers will buy and pay VH. So your revenue is going to be alpha VH, okay? Now, the other alternative for the firm is to charge the lower price, VL, okay? In that case, everyone buys, the low value as well as the high value types. So if you charge that lower price, your revenue is going to be VL. So it's optimum to charge the higher price if this revenue is greater than that revenue. When the price from the higher price is, when the revenue from the higher price is greater than the revenue from the lower price. And it's optimal to choose the lower price if the inequality is the other way around.
Oh, all right, sir.
Yeah.
Sir?
Yes.
So in participation constant, why we have not taken CH in that pH equation, VH and pH equation?
Just give me one moment, guys. I have to answer the door, right? Just 30 seconds. Yes. What was the question again?
So it was in the participation constant why we have not included CH in VH minus pH equation.
Okay, which participation constraint?
So the first one, PCH.
As I said, what do the incentive constraints guarantee? The incentive constraints guarantee that between these two options, the high type will find this option more preferable. And when we now come to the participation constraints, we are trying to guarantee that at least one option is better than not buying, okay? Which option do we have to worry about? Between the two buying options, the one which that kind of customer prefers, we have to guarantee that only that is better than not buying. If the other one is terrible, and if he prefers not to buy relative to this option, doesn't matter. He prefers whichever of the two buying options is more attractive to him. That is the option which has to be better than not buying. So if we are trying to guarantee that this is attractive enough to the high value customers, why do I have to write down CH? Here the burden is not present, so he doesn't face that cost.
This means CH is 0.
What is CH, yaar? I mean, look, you guys have to step back and not get lost in the thicket of algebra and everything, right? What exactly is CHCL? It is the cost that the buyer faces if he has to bear the burden. Now, one of the buying options has the burden included in it. It involves delay, it involves a slower product, or whatever that burden is. In this option, the burden is not there, so it doesn't face that cost. So why do I have to write down the cost in the participation constraints? It's fairly straightforward,
yes.
Right?
Okay, sir, thank you.
The steps are kind of intricate, so you have to go and revise and go through it. But the setup of the problem is very commonsensical. So just relax and step back and keep your intuitive grasp on the problem, relate it to the stories that I've said, and then things will make sense. Anyway, I will let you, I'll stop here. Over time. So